Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in schus, in memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav HaShalom, and it is in schus and merit of Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz Le'erich Yamim V'Shonim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we began chapter 4, Pedigree of Tanya, and in a very progressive and structured manner, the Alter Rebbe is laying out the very anatomy and structure of the Nefesh Elikis, the divine soul. In chapter 2, he spoke about its very identity being a divine element, Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish, with all the details. In chapter 3, the faculties of the divine soul, the Keiches of the Nefesh Elikis, Meichen and Midas, and being that it's a divine soul, so its mind and its emotions are completely immersed in divine elements of understanding the divine and contemplating on it, and in turn giving birth to divine emotions, love, awe, reverence, glorification, beautification of the divine, as explained in chapter 3. And now in chapter 4, to complete the picture, it's not just the divine identity of the soul and its divine faculties, but also in its very manifestation and expression, which means the Levushim, as the Alter Rebbe calls it, the garments. And they're called garments, as we explained, because on one hand, they're not the very essence of the person. For example, faculties, like the limbs of the body, are a very big part of the soul. Garments are outward expressions, thought, speech, and action. And like garments hanging in your closet, your clothing, they are themselves empty. They need something to fill them with. On the other hand, without garments, you don't have expression. If you only had the faculties of the mind and the emotions, and you didn't have thought, speech, or action, then the mind would be ideas in your brain, but you could also be asleep and not thinking about them. Thought is expression of your mind to yourself. Dibur, speech, is expression to others. Or even speaking, when you speak v'debartabam, words of Torah, but they're expressed in words, in actual words, tangible words. And then finally, action is building something, some form of expression through action. So if you just had the faculties, yes, you can have a mind and emotions that are divine, but they need levushim to be expressive. Because even contemplating, when you say contemplating on godliness, or feeling the divine, feeling love toward God, we're not just talking how it's dormant within the faculties, their potential to be so. It's like saying a person has the ability to throw a stone. Just use a simple example, or to write something, or to walk somewhere. So yes, your legs have the ability to walk. Your arm has the ability to write or to throw something. But unless you're doing it, it's just a koyach. You could basically call it a faculty in its potential state. It's there. But if you're not actually doing either means through thinking about it, you're consciously thinking about one of the millions of ideas in your mind, or you're speaking about it, or you're acting on it. You're doing something. So in truth is, if you really think about it, even though he didn't use the word levushim in chapter 3, the first point to make in chapter 4 is that which he spoke about in chapter 3, for the divine soul to even manifest in a deliberate and focused contemplation, his bonus and godliness, is already mean that you're using your machshava. If you're talking about implementing, giving birth to an emotion called love, or reverence, and awe, ava and yira, so we're not just talking about that the neshama has a fundamental love for God, but it's a conscious one, a deliberate one. That means that you're using your faculties, whether it's machshava, dibur, or ma'aseh. All the different ways that we're going to discuss in detail now in chapter 4. So the first thing that chapter 4 adds is that the Nefesh HaLekis and its faculties essentially require these Levushim. So he doesn't use that expression required because it's obvious, but it's part of the whole manifestation of the divine soul manifesting in this world. We're not just talking about the Nefesh HaLekis as an idea, we're talking about how does it experience things. So being that it's chelik alekam emal mamish, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, everything we learned in chapter 2, that's why its faculties are divine in its meichen and midas. And how does that manifest? That's through garments. That's through the levushim. So in the words of the Alter Rebbe, just to go over what we learned last week, v'oid yesh l'chol nefesh halekish shleisha levushim she'machshava dibur ha'maisa. Take away this machshava dibur ha'maisa. It's always best when you want to understand something is what if it didn't have it, God forbid, then you don't have any implementation, not thought, not speech, or not action. Yeah, you have a soul, a divine soul, and it has faculties, but they could all be dormant. They could all be inactive. So machshava dibur ha'maisa. And what does that mean? Machshava dibur ha'maisa shel tayag mitzvus ha'teira. Because we're talking about the nefesh halekis now. We're not just talking about the neutral garments that could, as we're going to learn later, could be used by the nefesh habamis. It too can control a person's garments. When a person thinks or speaks or does things that are egocentric, not God-centric, which is what personifies the animal soul. But we're not there right now. Now we're talking about the nefesh halekis. Nefesh halekis is levushim, like he says clearly, yesh nefesh halekis shleisha levushim. Machshava dibur ha'maisa means that they're manifesting, not just in concept that the nefesh halekis has divine faculties, but in actualization, shel tayag mitzvus ha'teira. That the machshava dibur ha'maisa are thought, speech, and action of the tayag mitzvus ha'teira, which require these garments. Now, of course, the garments alone, without the faculties, are empty. But with the faculties, with the garments, that really brings alive the divine soul in its full glory. And then he spells out, when a person performs an action, all the actionable mitzvahs, which are the majority of mitzvahs. Ubedibur, in speech, hu esek, bepirush kol tayag mitzvahs v'hilchesein. He's esek in interpreting and saying, v'debartabam, speaking about all the 613 mitzvahs and their halachas. Essentially, it's like learning with speech, with words. Ubemachshava, and his thought, which in effect, essentially, you can't speak if you're not thinking. But machshava hu masik kol mashe efshel lehasik bepardes hatera. He comprehends, he understands everything one can understand in Torah. He immerses his thought in whatever he can grasp in Torah, bepardes, and pshat, remez, drus, sod of Torah, the 4 different dimensions of Torah. So when he does that, what happens? Like he said right at the beginning of the chapter, Hare klolos tayag evrei nafshe meluboshim b'tayag mitzvus hatera. Meluboshim. Without that, there's no levushim. Then the tayag mitzvus, the tayag evrei nafshe remain evrei nafshe. 613 components of your soul. Fine. But for them to actualize and express their divinity is when they're meluboshim b'tayag mitzvus hatera, which is only through a levush. They have to manifest in something. Now, in Inyan, you could say, can a neshama without levushim, just for argument's sake, in heaven, in its root, can it exist without levushim? Well, first of all, in Gan Eden, neshamas learn Torah. So they're also actualizing it in some way. Machshava, dibur, there may not be maisa above, because you can't do a mitzvah in Gan Eden or in Elam Haba. Mitzvahs are dafka in this world. But the mitzvahs of dibur machshava, you could say, are there. But if you go all the way to the root of neshamas in their deepest place, yeah, you could argue that a neshama is just a divine entity, before Yorda, before it descended and came part of reality of neshama shenesata b'tahiri, ata barasa, ata yitzarta, ata nefachta, ata meshama b'kirbi. But we know the whole purpose is tachlis hakavona, is tshuva ma'asim tevim be'elam haza, as we're going to learn later in this chapter, that you have to do this in this world. And for this world to manifest in the neshama, it's not just good enough as the neshama is sitting and asleep or sitting in its environment and not doing anything. It has to think, speak, and express and act godly. The story with the Alter Rebbe, there was a chassid he had, who was a brilliant man. And the Alter Rebbe said to him, why aren't you using your brilliance? He says, Rebbe, you know that I have the capacity to be a Gaon, to be a great scholar. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, just like a Ganef, interesting example, just like a thief is not someone who could steal, but someone who steals. Now, a person who could steal there's no Aveda. Everybody could steal. But a thief is called someone who does steal, not just who could steal. So to a Gaon, a scholar is someone who learns, not just who could learn, but someone who actually learns. So it's a simple statement, actualization. Sometimes we get caught up. I'm able to do it, but that's not the kavanah. The kavanah is to do it. And in this case, do means thought, speech, and action. So bottom line is, so this then Alter Rebbe says, that's where we reached it last week. It's critical to understand that we're taking care, basically the dynamics is the soul itself, its faculties, and the expression of its faculties. Being that we're talking about the divine soul, all of these are divine. But where does it really come to life is in this last step. Because without the thought, speech, and action, you don't have the Levushim, that the tayag evrei nafshe, as divine as they may be, are not melubash b'tayag mitzvahs, because you need machshava dibur ma'aseh to achieve that. But now the Alter Rebbe is going to spell out specifically in detail, he's going to spell out what does this mean, this total immersion of the neshama and all its faculties through these levushim. The Rebbe actually comments that the word hariklolos tayag evri nafshe should perhaps read haribichlolus, because then it's consistent with the next word that we're going to read now, ubeprotis. So, in other words, haribichlolus tayag evri nushim uleboshim, and how does it break down? The Alter Rebbe is not going to spell how it breaks down, because here he just said that when a person does kol mitzvahs maisis, ubediburu esig bepirish kol tayag mitzvahs. He's talking in general. He didn't break it down specifically, but Alter Rebbe is now going to give an example of how it breaks down specifically. So then it would make sense. In general, or protius, how does it break down in specifics? We're going to read right now. One more point before I continue. It's interesting, he uses the word kol several times. He says, it doesn't say b'maisa mitzvahs maisis, kol mitzvahs maisis. Ubedibur oisik bepirish kol taryag mitzvahs. And humasik kol masha efshar leilahasig. What's the kol? Because we're talking about that the divine soul is completely consumed, completely engulfed in divine experience. So its divine nature of chapter 2, its divine faculties of chapter 3 are completely engulfed in thought, speech, and action, but through of the tayag mitzvah satera. So the word kol. Take away kol, then there's still a piece that's not completely expressing itself in the divine. So, fine. Now we continue inside. Ubeprotis, he says now, ubeprotus, more specifically, we're going to describe what we just said in general terms. We said the tayag evrei hanefesh, but there's tayag is 613. So now he's going to break it down to going back to chapter 3 into the two categories. Remember, the main categories of keches hanefesh is the sholosh imes, the three mothers, which is chochma bina das, and the sheva kfulis, the 7 doubles, which are the 7 emotions. There we discussed that the moichin is the contemplation on the divine, on mamala kalam, and sevav kalam, and kula kamei, kala chashiv, how God fills existence, how God transcends existence, how everything is nullified before Him. And that gives birth to emotions through das, which is skashus, the binding, the intimacy, that you personally intimate with this contemplation, not just as an abstract idea. God gives birth to emotions. The primary ones he described was love and reverence, in the order of yira b'moyach, then pachad b'lev, and then ava kedish be'esh, a consuming fiery love and passion. So now he's going to spell out how this moichin and midas manifest in machshava dibur ma'aseh. So that's what we're going to describe right now, udebapratis. Which faculties are manifest in which of the 3 garments? So he begins. Ubeprotus. Bechinas chochma bina das. Bechinas Chabad, which is chochma bina das shebenafshe. Muluboshes bahasogas hateira. So Chabad, which of course is mind, which garment does it use to express itself? Remember, the mind without thought, without machshava, is just a mind. As I said, you could not be, it's impossible not to be thinking about anything. But all the ideas in your mind are not conscious thoughts. You could be asleep. So even though your mind, mishetetas tomid, is always turning, is always moving, but for the mind, the faculty called Chabad, what Levush does it use primarily, or even exclusively? Machshava. So the first thing is that your soul's chochma, bina, and das, the chochma, bina, das shebenafshe, melubwashes, in which levush, in the levush, through the garment of machshava, in grasping, shu masig bepshat remez drusu sod, basogas hatera, in grasping and understanding and comprehending Torah, in what? So masig, which masig bepshat remez drusu sod, that when a person uses their mind through the levush, like he said, mulabosh is basogas hatera, because the mind could also be used for something else. You could be thinking about mathematics. You could be thinking about neutral matters. You could also be thinking about other things, which we'll talk about later when we get to the animal soul. But by the nefesh halikis, what, practically speaking, what is the mind? How does it express itself in its garment? Through the garment of thought. And what are you doing with your thought? Shu masig. He's actually thinking right now. He's exercising his mind to comprehend pshat, bepshat, remez, drusu, sod. In the 4 different dimensions of Torah, he repeats it a second time. He said it before in the general terms, machshava, but now he's specifically speaking about learning Torah. But more than that, he's not just learning Torah, that he said also before, but using the machshava to what? To concentrate and understand Torah in all the 4 dimensions of the literal, the allegorical, the homiletic, and the mystical or esoteric. And the Alter Rebbe continues, because since now we're talking about the active process of using thought, not just the general statement that he said, b'chlolus, he continues, Kefi yechelis hasagose v'sherish nafshe l'mayla. Which means he's exercising his mind to the full capacity of his intellect. Means as much as you potentially are capable of, that which you're not capable of, you're not capable of. But your machshava, when you're sitting down now, and the mind, which as I said is dormant, it's there. Your mind has full of ideas. And in the case of the divine soul and the nefesh halikis, the mind is a divine mind. But now you're actively opening up a sefer, or you're contemplating and concentrating and comprehending Torah, pshat, remez, drusu, sod, to the most of your, to the potential, to the capacity of your abilities, to the capacity of your ability to understand. And then the Alter Rebbe adds, v'sherish nafshe l'mayla, and the root of his nefesh above, the spiritual root of the soul. And why does Alter Rebbe add that? It's clear that he's not trying to say that we have to go and try to figure out this, and we have to try to comprehend the root of our soul. What he's coming to explain is that each person has their own capacity, has their own ability. There's a story told that Izal was teaching Torah to his students. One of his students was the Alshich, Rabbi Alshich. And he snoozed off, he fell asleep during a certain part of the Izal's teaching. That Izal explained because the neshama of Rabbi Moshe Alshich is shaykh to Elam Hadrush, to the world of homiletics. And since what was being taught was not in that connection, so his neshama did not respond. In a sense, his neshama fell asleep. What do we see from this? Like we say every day in davening, what means seichel kenu? The whole Torah was given to everybody. Torah tziv alanu Moshe Merash Gilas Yaakov. But in Torah itself, every neshama, like we learned in chapter 2, that the neshamas branch off. And there are different types of neshamas, and different levels. So neshama, like we know that Torah is made up of Shishim Ribu Eisis L'Torah, that's the Rosh Tevis Yisrael. Yes, Shishim Ribu Eisis L'Torah. It's explained in Likutei Torah and other places. Practically, there's no 600,000, but there's 600,000 Eisis HaMachshava, and when you, with the vowels and so on, what does it correspond to? Because every neshama of the 600,000 collective souls has a part in the Torah. So it has its connection. Some are connected to Drush, some to Pshat, some the Remez, Drush Sod, or different ways of breaking it down. So the Alter Rebbe is coming here to tell us that when you're using your machshava, remember, we're not just talking the divine faculty called Chochmah Bina Das, but it's manifesting through thought. That every person kafi yecheles asagose, and the fact is v'sheidish nafshe lamayla, which is why his neshama is connected to, his nefesh is connected to a particular part of the Torah. So we're not talking about understanding. We don't have to go delve what exactly is your sheidish. The Alter Rebbe is saying it more of a statement to tell us that nefashos have different connections lamayla to the Torah, and that's why when a person does delve into and study, he's actually studying according to his spiritual root, whether he knows it or not what that root is, but that is what giving him the ability to actually actualize his mind's understanding of Torah. So here you have the process of how the first levush, machshava, is being used to be, like he says, and it's dafke Torah, pshat remez drush sod. And the machshava is as much as you're capable of. So in other words, two people can be sitting and learning, both using their thought, which is their focused and conscious thinking about and actualizing their mind in the learning, but it's going to be different because this one, both of them have different yechelos asagose. One person maybe has a mind or a thought process that's superior to another. Say the word superior doesn't mean superior, it means different. And they have different sheidish nafshe lamayla. So that's where machshava comes into play because it's different. Now the meichin of the Chabad are also different, but they're not being actualized until they come to the thought process, which is what we're learning about now. So that covers machshava and the Chabad shebenafshe. So what we spoke about in chapter 3, Chabad, machshava is its levush, its appropriate or primary levush of expression. The fact is, as we're going to mention shortly, Torah also spoken. But the main chiddush here is the Torah is the mind, and it makes total sense. The mind uses thought. Now, let's talk about the midas. The second part of the Nefesh Elokis is its midas. The Sheva Kfules, the 7 doubles, which are the 7 midas. Ava and Yira, which are the main ones we're discussing here. So now he continues. He says, V'han midas, Shen Yira v'Ava, v'an fein v'tel desein. The midas, the emotions, which are here too the same order like in chapter 3, that are the emotional powers of your soul, namely reverence and love, yira v'ava, and he continues, v'anfeim, their branches and derivatives, v'sel desein, and their derivatives, which in Tanya, in chapter 3, when we learned, he also focused mostly on yira and ava. He mentioned also tiferes, but he didn't go into Netzach Hed Yesod and Malchus. Netzach Hed Yesod, sometimes you can count Malchus, 7 midas. So Malchus, yes, Malchus too. Because they are branches of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. But Sel Desein is more than branches. So the same means also derivatives. Because of the 7 emotions in turn, or Yirav and Av, I should say, in turn, not just branch into the others, but they also have offspring, so to speak. So he doesn't spell that out here, but he does mention both expressions, Anfein v'sel desein. So what do they manifest in? We talked Chabad shebenefesh, shebenafshei, that meluboshes, that's the garment is in machshava through understanding and concentrating and learning Torah to your capacity. What about the midas? So he says, meluboshes, B'kiyam ha-mitzvahs b'maisa v'dibur. They manifest and are expressed in observing the Torah through our garments of action and speech. Remember, we're talking about the Nefesh Elikis again. It's the divine soul. So it's all about divine activity, divine speech, and divine action. So the Midas, he says, they express themselves through the garments of action and speech. Now you can ask the question, 1 second. First of all, Midas are also machshava. You can also think thoughts of love, not just speak about it. So one of the explanations is that he's not going, the Alter Rebbe, to exhaustive detail of how everything uses machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh. Like I mentioned before, learning Torah is also a form of dibur. Midas is also machshava, but he's talking the main chidush, because he's not going into breaking it down in all the details. So Midas, what's the primary role of Midas? It's a relationship with another. When you think thoughts of love, that's beautiful. It's more than dormant love that's in your faculties that you're not even aware of. So at least it's manifest in the thought, in the garment that relates to you. But Midas, its main focus is relationship. Loving another. Loving Hashem. Loving another. And that is through expression, through dibur and ma'aseh. The levushim, what's called levusha nifrid, it's not just a garment where you express it to yourself, but you're also expressing it to another. So Midas is primarily around dibur and ma'aseh for that reason, even though there's machshava as well. It's not contradicting it. So he's really focusing on the main addition that he's adding here. And the addition is that the Midas of Yira, Va'ava, and their branches and derivatives, they are manifesting and engaging through the garments of action and speech. And here again, you can have love in your heart and not even aware of it. That's not the goal. The goal is to manifest it. And in the divine soul, it manifests through 3 garments. So Chabad Shebenefesh, through the Hasaga of Torah, because that's very clear. Torah connects to a thought. And now, Midas of Yira and Ava and all their branches, that is through the garments of action and speech. And then he gives an example. Shu Talmud Torah shekeneged kula. What's the Alter Rebbe adding with this? And there's no other ways of action and speech. There's davening, not Talmud Torah. They're speaking kind words to somebody, divrei nachas, and so on. But he uses Talmud Torah because he says shekeneged kulam. That in a way you can perhaps say that the highest and maybe superior use of your speech is when you're expressing and verbalizing the words in Torah, v'dibarta, you're speaking the study of Torah, because Torah is equal to all the commandments, like the Mishnah says in Peah. Shekeneged kulam. So it could be the Alter Rebbe is giving an example. Remember, right before he spoke about Torah too, Hasaga. But now, he's talking about how it comes into Dibur and Ma'aseh. But of course, the question now is, love and awe, or reverence, or love and reverence, how does it manifest, and what does it have to do with Ma'aseh mitzvahs? You put on tefillin, you keep Shabbos, you eat kashrus. Why are you saying that Ava v'Yira are expressed through that, through thought and through speech and action? And that's what Alter Rebbe is going to address next. We stop here. Everyone have a good tavoch. Be well. Remember, TanyaApplied.com. You can listen to all these programs and also submit any questions. Be well. Kol Tov.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.